indeed, and delighted to see you in the chair. And thanks to the House authorities for allowing me to raise what I regard as a very important matter in relation to my constituency. Now, I'm aware of a certain event in another part of Wakefield on Thursday. You will no doubt be listening carefully to ensure that I avoid raising any of such matters, and I undertake not to do so. I'm most concerned to raise issues affecting that part of my constituency, which I've described as South East Wakefield, which is more or less but not entirely coterminous with the constituency of Hemsworth, which I've represented now for more than 26 years. Now, prompted in part by government rhetoric about levelling up, I want to show how areas such as the one I represent are desperately in need of a new deal in this country. But let me first tell the House about a conversation I had the other day with a young man, Zach Gaskell, 12 years old, who came along to see me with his dad, Lee. And Zach is an elected member of the Youth Parliament for our area. It was a great privilege to meet him. I asked him how he had come to be elected, what his manifesto had said. And he said, well, the most important thing was that people in power need to listen to the voices of young people. After all, he said, we, i.e. younger people, are the future. And I agree with him. I'm sure that we all do. But the truth is that the opportunities for young people in the southeast of the Wakefield district are severely limited. In fact, the situation is becoming dire. And having carefully read much of the government information about levelling up, I've come to the conclusion that there's something missing. What I think the government needs, what the country needs, if we're going to talk about levelling up, is some kind of analytical tool to guide us, and by which we can measure the success or failure of the government in achieving greater equality of economic opportunity for areas such as South East of Wakefield. And I believe that there is such an analytical tool lying easily to hand, and the country should use it. We call it social mobility these days. It used to be assumed that the next generation, the generation of the Zacks of this world, would get a better life than the previous generation, of our generation. And I think that's probably what brought most of us into politics, the idea we want to improve the way that which the country and the world operates. Some people call it the British promise. We now often call it social mobility. But with the increasingly centralised government, which is focused around Whitehall, the cities of Westminster and London, it's no longer the case that areas such as the southeast of Wakefield, that this British promise of a better life will be delivered. In rather, areas like mine are being held back, and I want to show why, how, and what we might do to think about changing the life chances of people I represent. My constituency is amongst the least socially mobile in the whole of England. There are 533 seats, constituencies. My constituency is the fourth worst in terms of social mobility, with the 529th out of 533 seats. Now, the government has acknowledged this wider problem. I think it's why levelling up has been developed, the idea of levelling up, and why the government appointed the Social Mobility Commission and then has now appointed the Social Mobility SAR. And if they can't offer assistance to a constituency like mine, then we know the model which the government is using doesn't work. Now, what's curious about the commission that was set up was the whole lot of them resigned. Members may remember, back in 2020, they said that inequality in Britain is now entrenched from birth through to work. And certainly, that is a description of the area I represent. And now the new social mobility czar has said that working class kids maybe shouldn't aim so high. Indeed, last week it was Catherine Berbelsing. She said, we should stop fixating about getting poor children to university. That was an extraordinary thing to say. And we should encourage them instead to celebrate small steps up the ladder. It just isn't good enough. Is that the best that the government's appointee can say to Zach and to his friends? Don't aim high, Zach. Take a few small steps. That's maybe all you can expect. And what does that advice mean in practice? It means that a child born into a certain group in my constituency or elsewhere may well be likely to die later in life within the same social group which their parents and grandparents were part of. The ability to move up the ladder is almost negligent in an area like mine. And the situation's getting worse. You can link, I think, social mobility to levels of deprivation. The two things are interconnected. My area is becoming more deprived as this Tory government has gone on, not less. For example, we are now the 111 most deprived of the English constituencies. In 2015, we were the 130th. So we've declined by 29 positions. Probably that's not surprising, given that deprivation is growing and it relates to the lack of social mobility in our area. Now, look, I pay tribute to the people of my area. They work hard. They were the miners who powered our country, lit our country, and did all the things necessary in the worst possible conditions imaginable at work. They're wonderful people. I guess we all think that about our own constituents. But in my case, it is the truth. And there are many companies, some led by ex-miners in my area, who want to help. They are exemplary, rooted in the local community. Many of the leaders of those companies have a social conscience, and they want to bring social mobility back to life, give local people more opportunities, and to reverse the trends in deprivation. But they desperately need help and support. Now, the Council will be putting in bids, I hope anyway, for levelling up funds, which could help locally. And if we're successful, obviously it is to be welcomed. But if we're going to give the kids in Wakefield a chance, we also need the government to address the issues which are interconnected with deprivation and with the lack of social mobility. And I just want to briefly touch on 405. The first is productivity. We measure these days productivity per head by something called GVA, gross value added. In Yorkshire and Humber, gross value added per worker is 21,000, just over. In London, it's 48,000. And so the productivity per head in Yorkshire as a whole, and it's slightly worse in my constituency, is £27,000 a year less than the productivity for workers. In London, it's because of lack of investment. Without investment, obviously, work will be less productive. And we can therefore expect wages to be lower if the productivity of each worker is lower. And that is the case. So that's the second item. In terms of wages and salaries, Hemsworth average pay is £495 a week. In the Prime Minister's constituency, it's £728 a week. And so on the average, taking the workers as a whole between Hemsworth in my constituency, the Prime Minister's constituency, we're paid £12,000 a year less than they are in the Prime Minister's constituency. And what's worse is that the growth in earnings since 2010 in Hemsworth was 6%. In the UK, it was 22%, almost 4 times more growth in wages. And I think I relate that back to the lack of investment and productivity. We're falling behind. We're falling further behind. And you can see the problems in our areas, both chronic as well as acute. We desperately need investment. This brings me to my third point. In order to be mobile, in a population where the place of work is no longer in the local village, I represent 23 former colliery villages. The work was in each village. Now that the work has gone, and you have to travel some distance to get to decent employment. The problem is that a quarter of all the people in our constituency don't have access to a car. And public transport, which is my next point, is being cut back. rail and bus routes are being cut. Now, I placed my office deliberately in a station so people could get there who don't have a car. But the train service is being cut through the very station where my office is. Northern Rail, it's cut services from May 2022 this year, including the links to Sheffield and to Leeds, where there are jobs. And the same with buses. I represent 23 villages. I guess all of us who represent rural areas know that the bus services are in decline. In our area, they're in severe decline. 7 routes with weekend timetables have been cut. 29 with weekday timetables have been affected. And then on top of that, and perhaps because of it, transport spending in Yorkshire is a third of that which is spent per head in London, comparing £906 in London, £300 odd in Yorkshire. We need £86 billion to be put on a par with London. Now, how are we going to get geographic mobility and the connection with social mobility if so many people don't have cars and if public transport is being reduced in the way that I've just described? Now, the Minister may have in her briefing notes something about HS2. Well, HS2 was cut on the eastern leg through Yorkshire up to Leeds. But in any event, though 100 million has been left, I think, to see whether they can build an inter-urban link between Sheffield and Leeds. But the fact is, HS2 would drive a corridor as wide as 2 motorways through our constituency, but not provide any stations or halts there. We'd have all the pain, but none of the gain. I don't find HS2 at all a solution. What we need is proper interconnectivity, and I'm sure many other members would say the same about their area. But in an area where we have declining levels of social mobility and increasing levels of deprivation, public transport is absolutely imperative. This brings me to my further point, which is to do with the cuts as a result of austerity. Wakefield Council has suffered cuts since 2015 of £57 million in real terms. Now, it may be that the Minister might say, well, there's £20 million in levelling up funds, but the £20 million, which would be welcome, is being funded by the very cuts which the public services in our area have suffered. It's not as though this is new money. It's money which is being recycled from cuts which have been made. And what's particularly painful is the cuts to school funding in our area. We've lost almost £400 per pupil, per school, in our constituency. Now, when the social mobility TAR says to kids in our area, just take a few steps, don't dream of going to university, the truth is there are only small steps possible because of the cuts to the schools. And I take exception and offence at the advice which has been given to people like Zach. My final point about the issues which might help to address some of the issues is about digital exclusion. We all know that the economy is changing before our eyes, and new industrial revolutions taking place. In fact, it's well on its way, as we know, and with more to come with AI and all the other prospects which are available to us. But the truth is that connectivity to the internet, which is so important to building a lively cultural and economic life in a constituency, is restricted in the South East of Wakefield. The broadband speeds are amongst the worst in the whole country. 3/4 of the communities in my area are in the worst 30% of areas with broadband connectivity. The average download speed in Hemsworth itself is 52 MPS, it's called. In the Prime Minister constituency, it's twice as high, it's 107. It's not acceptable that communities should be left behind in this way by public transport, by the cuts and other things which I've described. Wherever you look, we're being held back. What is needed is an active government which will secure investment, increase productivity, address the problems of geographic mobility as a result of the cuts in the public transport, restore the service cuts, particularly in the schools, which I feel passionate about, and invest in broadband and offer real opportunities to local business leaders who want to root themselves back into the community, who recognise the value of a loyal and hard-working workforce and want to give chance to those people to restore the kind of life which people had before the mines were closed all those years ago now. All of these steps could and would help to improve opportunity in our area. I just hope the government's listening, though sometimes I doubt that it is. And let me finish on a bigger question. South East Wakefield has issues which require active government, not the small government which the Chancellor is always rabbiting on about. And it is the case also in many other communities across the country, especially in the wake of the COVID pandemic. But the issues which I've described show how chronic and acute the problems are in South East Wakefield. This ought to lead us to pose a bigger question as to whether or not the current neoliberal economic model and the ossified, over-centralised state frameworks can really deliver social justice. I don't believe that they can. The levels of inequality are now almost verging on the obscene in parts of our country. The richest people in society increased their wealth by 700 billion since the crash, yet for people in my constituency, as I've described, wages and salaries are declining or stagnating. The cost of living is skyrocketing and public services are becoming overstretched. And so, within this national context, it's perhaps unsurprising that areas like mine have been held back for so long. And whilst the idea of levelling up money is to be welcomed, and we'll bid for it, and I will engage in it, we do need to recognise that a full-scale economic system change and nothing less will do, together with proper devolution of power. So people who make decisions can understand the impact of their decisions on local people, something which doesn't happen now. Long ago, I came to the conclusion that the economic, cultural, political and social distances between decision makers here in the capital and areas like South East Wakefield are so vast as to ensure that there will be no progress towards social justice in our area without radical change. This is because the decision makers are so remote from the lives as it's lived by the people I represent. And I represent Middle England, right in the middle of the country. People who work hard, play by the rules, pay the taxes, and yet are being left behind. So let me leave this final thought with the Minister. Can she convincingly say to the young people like Zach of my area that the status quo, as it's structured now, with all its structural problems, can really offer the change which the southeast of Wakefield requires? My answer to that question is, I don't believe so.